All right, welcome back, guys. In this video, we're going to be covering how to underwrite a seller finance deal. Now, there is many ways you could underwrite a deal, and depending if there's interest or a down payment, that will change a whole lot. But for the simplicity of you guys just like really grasping it, I'm going to show you guys how to underwrite seller finance where there's no amortization schedule and there's no interest. And this is very practical because this is how I actually acquire and underwrite the majority of the real estate I own today. So let's dive into it. Let's say we come across this seller. It's off market. We hit them up. They want 100,000, and we said, "Hey, seller, if I can give you the 100,000, would you be open to seller finance?" They said, "Sure." We said, "Great. Let me run some numbers. I'll get back to you with an offer." So now we got to go to the drawing board. And so there's really two things that I care about most in a seller finance deal, and quite frankly, in just most transactions, and that's going to be cash flow. I want money coming into my pocket every single month, and I want equity, right? When I have to cash this seller out, or when I choose to, I want to make sure that I'm going to have a good chunk of equity. So cash flow, equity, those are the things I care about. Now let's talk about actually underwriting these deals. First, it's always going to start with the purchase price. There's only two things with underwriting creative finance that we have to figure out. What can I pay my seller every single month that allows for me to cash flow? And how long, right? That goes back to the previous video, that term. How long do I need to be able to build a good chunk of equity? That way I'm not at risk. So cash flow, equity, that's what we care about. And then as far as figuring out stuff, I just need to figure out what can I pay the seller monthly and how long do I need, right? Let's jump into it. So we got the purchase price. Now I got to figure out what can I pay my seller on a monthly basis. Because these deals have no interest and they're not going to be on an AM schedule, this is going to be a very different approach than maybe what you're used to. Now, in later videos, we will cover how to run numbers with interest, down payment on an AM schedule. But for the simplicity of this video, don't worry about that right now. Okay, so we got the purchase price. 100,000 is what the seller wants to sell it for. Now we just have to figure out what can I pay the seller on a monthly basis. Now, the way I like to come up with that number is I like to reverse engineer the math here. So the formula to figure out what I could pay my seller starts with what can this house rent for? So let's say I go on Zillow and I look at rental comps, or I go on rentometer.com and I put in the basic info. It's going to tell me what could the house rent for. That's step number one. What would this house rent for? So let's say I do a little bit of homework and I find out this house could rent for $2,000 a month. Okay, that's step number one. Now we're just going to be subtracting all of the expenses, and that's going to leave me with what I could pay our seller. So just follow along here. Rent it for $2,000 a month, and now we're going to subtract some of the expenses. Now for me, on a basic single family, I want to be somewhere between $300 and $500 a month. For the sake of this video, I'm going to take out 5, and that is what I normally do. So I'm going to start subtracting line items from this gross rent. So I want to make $500 a month, okay? The other expenses that we need to take into account are anything that's hard, right? So that would be the taxes, that would be the insurance, that would be the HOA if there is one, things of that nature. Now, two things that aren't necessarily hard fixed expenses would be vacancy and would be our capital expenditures. And we're going to subtract each of those inside this formula. Now, I just want to pause here and explain some of this to you. So vacancy is pretty simple, right? That means the property is going to be vacant, could be vacant for a couple months. Maybe a tenant moves out. Maybe they just can't afford it. Maybe I got to evict them, and that's why it went vacant. Many reasons why a property could go vacant, but we as smart investors want to account for that. So I think the most realistic thing you could do is factor in 10% of the gross rent, right? So if it can rent for $2,000, I'm going to factor in my vacancy at 10% of that, which would be $200 going towards vacancy, saving that for the rainy day. Now, the next piece, like I mentioned, is our capital expenditures. Capital expenditures are just going to be the big expenses that will definitely come over time. Quick little example of that would be, the roof or the HVAC unit, something big that's definitely going to happen. We want to factor. Whether the property is brand new or super old, those things will come. Now, what I like to do is you can kind of play with this number depending on the property condition. So if I'm buying a home and it has a brand new roof on it, brand new HVAC system, then I don't really have to be too conservative. And my rule of thumb with that, if it's in good shape, is I'm going to factor in 10% for the capital expenditures. If those items, those bigger expensive items, will come due sooner, right? So maybe the roof only has 5-6 years left on it. Maybe the HVAC is 10 plus years old. Then I'm going to increase the percentage and I'm going to factor in probably 20%. But to keep things simple, let's say this house is in good shape, newer roof, newer HVAC system. I'll just factor in 10% for those capital expenditures. So let's go CapEx at 10%, which would be another $200 coming out of the equation. All right. So right now we have the gross rent, $2,000 a month. We have our $500 profit that I want to make on this as a rental. I got my vacancy of 10%. I like to have that fixed, period. That's going to be a $200 a month coming out. Capital expenditures, another 10%. That's another $200. And again, if you guys had stuff like, an HOA or maybe back taxes that you're going to be taking care of, stuff like that, or utilities, right? If there's a common area, say it's a 3-unit, 4-unit complex, little multifamily, whatever the case is, and the owner is paying some common area, maybe it's a hallway and he pays electric for that, you want to factor that in. Any and all hard expenses. And then on top of that, the CapEx and the vacancy. Now, 2 things that need to be added with the hard expenses, again, are the taxes and insurance. So that needs to factor into the equation. So let's say with the tax, let's say that comes out to $200 a month. And let's say the insurance, that comes out to $100 a month, something like that. So now we have our hard expenses, we got our capital expenditures, we got the vacancy, and what we want to make on a monthly basis. All we're going to do now is subtract these things from our gross rent, and that is going to leave us with what we are able to pay our seller, right? So let's work through the math on that. So $2,000, we take out 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 1,200. That leaves us with a payment of $1,200, $800 a month going to our seller. So we could pay our seller $800 a month, and that allows for us to make $500 a month, factor in vacancy and just all of these other line items. All right, so now we got the purchase price figured out, we got our monthly payment figured out. The last thing we have to figure out is how long do I need to pay the seller off? Now, this is again going to be reverse engineered, and it's going to be somewhat of like a plug and play. What I normally recommend is starting with anywhere from 8 to 10 years. That's kind of ideal. The longer, the better, right? The more time I have to pay the seller off, the better. So for this, let's just start with 10. And again, we don't know if 10 years is going to work until we actually just do the math. So really what this starts with is I just need to figure out how much have I paid this seller over the course of 10 years. Very simple stuff. So if I'm paying them $800 a month, there's no interest on the deal, then that means this $800 a month is coming off of this $100,000 balance that I owe the seller, right? So if I go $800 a month times 12 months, that means I've paid $9,600. $9,600 a year is coming off of this balance. If I go times 10 years, then that means I've paid $96,000, and by that 10-year mark, I only owe them $4,000. Are you guys following me with that? So let's run that back one more time. Let's go 8 years this time. Let's see if we could do 10. Definitely works. Now let's see if we can do 8. Sorry about that writing. It's terrible, but you guys get it. All right, so again, $800 a month. That's going to go in the calculator. $800 a month coming off of this balance times 12 months is again $9,600 in 1 year coming off of that balance. Now let's see how much I've paid off over the course of 8 years. So I'm going to go $9,600 a year times 8 years. That means I've paid off $76,800 off of my $100,000 balance, right? So I almost paid this thing off in full. I got a large chunk of equity at this point. Now, really what this kind of comes down to is you need to figure out, you're almost like taking a bet. It's like, do I bet the property is going to be worth more than what I owe at the end of the balloon? So just with the simple math, when we did the 10-year balloon, it said that we owe the seller $4,000 at that point. If the property's worth $100,000 today, in 10 years from now, do I bet it's going to be worth more than what's owed? Is it going to be worth more than the $4,000 that's owed at that 10-year mark. And I think that's a no-brainer, right? Absolutely. It's going to be worth more than $4,000 in 10 years from today, especially if it's worth $100,000 at this moment. So you're taking a bet there. Now, my rule of thumb is if I'm looking at a piece of real estate that is below $300,000, we're talking single family, maybe small multi, I need to see at least $40,000 in equity, period. That's kind of my rule of thumb to be able to want to go into a deal and for it to be worth it. Now, when I take a bet, I'm not betting off of the future appreciation, right? If I, say somehow we ran the numbers and I owe 90 at that point, well, I'm not going to say like, oh, well, in 10 years, it's probably going to be worth 2, so I should be good. Now, you probably will be, but I'm not a gambler. I want to know for sure that I'm going to have a good chunk of equity, even in, worst case scenario. So what I'm really getting at is always base that equity gap off of today's market value. If it's worth 100 today and say I owe 40, that means I have 60 in equity. If it appreciates, which it probably will, then that's kind of like the cherry on top. That's just like, all right, I'm going to make a lot more money too. Hopefully you guys follow me with all this. So to kind of recap this, guys, what we care about is cash flow and equity. What you have to figure out is what can I pay the seller monthly, and that comes down to reverse engineering the math there, and then how long do I need? That's all it comes down to. I care about cash flow, care about equity, and to hone in on that, it's what can I pay the seller every single month that allows for me to cash flow this $500 a month. And then how long do I need to make sure I got a good chunk of equity? That way if things go sideways, I'm still going to be good to cash the seller out and put some cash in my pocket. If you guys have any questions on this, see me inside the community chat, and I'd be happy to help you guys out further. I'll see you guys in the next one.